Hello and welcome to NEDA Awareness Week, where everybody has a seat at the table. I'm Iskra Lawrence, a model, an Airy Real role model, and a brand ambassador for both the National Eating Disorder Association as well as L'Oreal's Prince's Trust. Today, I am thrilled to be the moderator for the wrap-up panel. Everybody has a seat at the table. This is going to be an extra special one, I can feel it. Before we get started, I would like to take this opportunity to introduce our esteemed panelists who are representing each of our 4 previous roundtables. So if you haven't watched them yet, go back and watch them as well. Mimi Cole is a future therapist and the host of a podcast, The Lovely Becoming. I really am into that name. As soon as I heard the podcast name, I was like, okay, I need to go find it. Shannon Nunnally is a kindergarten teacher, NEDA advocate, and mother of an eating disorder survivor. Nia Patterson is an eating disorders, mental health, and fat activist. James Rose is an LGBTQ+ actor, fitness professional. I think we can all use a little help working out at home these days, podcaster, and Instagram educator. You can learn more about our panelists and read their full bios at nedaawareness.org because you know they're all doing the most incredible work. So, thank you all for coming together to discuss highlights from your individual roundtables. I know all of those conversations were extremely empowering. So in this wrap-up discussion, our panelists will be talking about why everybody deserves a seat at the table, especially those who are underrepresented in the eating disorders community. So let's get this party started. We're going to jump right in with question number 1. So you each had the opportunity to participate in sessions discussing some of your personal experiences around navigating an eating disorder. What roundtable did you participate in, and what was your biggest takeaway from the discussions your group had?
I can jump in real quick. So I was a part of the Eating Disorders in the Black Community panel, and I think my biggest takeaway is that there's a lot of nuance to these conversations. I think while representation is really important, working within the spaces that we're currently in is also equally important. And so I think doing anti-racist work is really important for white providers because they are the majority at the moment, but also really working towards having more inclusivity and representation so people can really see themselves in the bodies and in the colors of the people who are their providers. So I think there's a lot of work to be done, and on the behalf of all different types of providers.
Agreed. Does anyone else want to add to that?
Yeah,
I will share. I was in the caregiver roundtable, and I think my biggest takeaway, what we seem to have in common, was that in the very beginning we were really lost, and it was just, we kind of didn't know what hit us, and what really came to be was we really grew in our strength and our understanding, and grew and setting boundaries and really learning that eating disorder behavior was not our child. Really being able to separate the two, but having that voice as a caregiver and the value in our lived experiences.
Thank you, Shannon. Okay, James, you add something?
So I participated in the LGBTQIA+ Voices panel, and I think one of the biggest takeaways, similar to how Mimi said there's a lot of nuance to these conversations, we realized the breadth of experiences there are within the queer community. And so the way that lesbians may experience eating disorders and may experience expectations and may experience diet culture is going to be different than the way the gay community may experience this. And depending on your gender, you're going to have a different relationship to diet culture, to eating disorder behaviors, to the expectations put upon your body by the culture created. And so when we're looking at this breadth of experiences that include both gender and sexuality, we notice that it's impossible to cover everything in a 60-second panel, or in a 60-minute panel rather, because there are as many experiences of queerness as there are people who are queer. So it's something that is a constant investment in learning. And I think that that's applicable to many of the other communities that we're talking about that are underrepresented in eating disorders. There are as many experiences of an eating disorder as there are people with them. And then when we get into these, intersections of both gender and sexuality, we're adding on layers that are so commonly misunderstood that it's impossible to just quantify in something that is as wonderful as a 60-minute panel, but also limiting.
Nia, do you have anything to share?
Yeah, so I participated in the higher weight roundtable, and I think my biggest takeaway was that so often people in larger bodies are given compromised care in terms of eating disorder care, but also just in terms of medical care all around and just how they're treated by medical providers. And also the fact that a lot of people in larger bodies are also diagnosed so much later because they just don't believe that they could have an eating disorder because they're in a fat body and the media portrays eating disorders as thin bodies. And then once you add in other marginalized identities, it gets even harder to diagnose people. And just the fact that a lot of times doctors don't even believe or can see that there is a problem because it just appears to them as like normal weight loss or normal weight gain. And that's just such an issue.
You're doing amazing. Thank you so much for sharing all of that.
Thank you.
Iskra, can I add something? One of the fascinating things in like learning about how different communities experience eating disorders and the different misconceptions around them, such as like what everyone has brought up here so far, is that oftentimes when we're centering like an issue, and so like let's call eating disorders like a cultural issue, right? Like that's something that we created as a society, that's our cultural issue that we're naming. And I think one of the fascinating things is like in the media, we try to portray, not we, but the media in general will try to portray the most extreme versions of this. And the most extreme version the media has portrayed is the thin white woman. And yet that's not a fair extremity because there are so many directions in which eating disorders affect people, and the extremities that we experience are different. Like what the trans community experiences as extreme is a stack of both a gendered experience and potentially a sexuality experience and potentially also an experience with fat phobia, diet culture, ableism, insert any other intersection there. And so what I think we're missing from the media narrative is noticing that it goes extreme in every direction and that they're all extremes that need to be honored with the same intensity and ferocity that we've allowed for thin white women to have for so long in the ED space.
Okay, so question 2. What do you think is the next step in our field to better serving your community or communities?
I have an answer, but I hate to go first.
You want to go first every time.
Yeah, please go first.
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so the first thing that comes to mind is education and training, and really providing support for people, especially in my field, who are upcoming clinicians, like becoming therapists or dietitians, because there's such a small number of BIPOC individuals who are in this field and doing this work, especially as it pertains to non-diet and weight inclusivity, and such a niche topic. So I think it starts there, and with representation in treatment centers, especially in the higher levels of care. It's really important for people to be doing this work. But I think the thing is that they are doing this work, but aren't necessarily visible all the time or supported in their work. And so I think it's really important to diversify the people in positions of power and the people who are able to kind of make those bigger decisions.
Did you come against any obstacles or any kind of closed doors or barriers on your way to becoming a therapist? What's that look like for you? And anyone who is looking to go down that route, have you got any advice for them?
Yeah, so it's actually interesting. I was talking about this the other day, that in my recovery journey, I had a lot of privilege in that I was able to have a really good treatment team, and I was able to access graduate school. And so I haven't really faced any barriers that I am conscious of in terms of my journey to become a therapist. But I think it's important to recognize too that sometimes it can be a little bit of a lonely place when there's not many people who look like you. And so that's an interesting thing to think about. And I think it's powerful when we see like role models with the same type of hair that we have, or the same type of body that you have, or colored skin, and things like that. So I think while consciously I might not have seen some barriers, maybe there were some at play that I'm not even aware of.
Mm-hmm. Anyone else? I don't know if you want me to repeat the question again, but it was
the original question. Yeah, I did have something, but I just don't remember what it was because we gave such a brilliant answer.
I know.
Yeah. What do you think is the next step in our field to better serving your community or communities?
Yeah, I also agree with Mimi that it's education and training for the LGBTQ plus community because there are so many misunderstandings about the community. And like I said earlier, there's so many experiences you can have. Like when we're just looking at gender, I mean, there are infinite genders because there are infinite people, there are infinite experiences of it. One of the barriers to my treatment as a non-binary person was that I walked into treatment not understanding my gender because I didn't grow up in a world that was inclusive of it and offered me that kind of language to understand that the reason that I was engaging in certain ED behaviors was because I was trying to fit two different types of genders that like within the binary, I was trying to shape myself to be a man and a woman at the same time, and I'm not either one. And so I was impressing upon myself this toxic binary that is the only framework we have that's societally accepted to view gender with, when it's not accurate for the population. We have so many genders. And so I think one of the onuses has to be on providers to seek out that education because you're not going to be given it in most places. So I think a great exercise is like, look at all the acronyms, like look at all the letters within the LGBTQIA+ acronym. And if you can't name 10 to 15 people that fall under each individual one, not to tokenize, but just to give yourself a massive population of experiences. You know, do you follow 10 to 15 transgender women that experience eating disorders and talk about it? Do you follow 10 to 15 asexual people that have talked about eating disorders and how their asexuality may have come in contact with that? I mean, if you're not able to find those people, and it is difficult, I grant you, like nothing worth having comes easily. This is hard work to do. But if we can't think about that in the same way that if we can't think of 10 to 15 or 100 to 150 Black and fat creators that we're not listening to that are speaking on these topics, we're doing ourselves such a disservice because we have not opened our mind to the breadth of experiences. When someone comes in for treatment, they will inevitably have experienced something in life that you as a provider have not. And so it's your job not to necessarily understand it fully, because sometimes without experiencing it, you can't fully understand it, but you can respect it and you can cerebrally comprehend it and you can hold space for it and you can learn the ways that you can offer affirmative care. So I say do the acronym exercise. Who do you know that are your resources here, and where are the gaps? Who's missing from your table of educators, and seek out those people because it's incredibly important.
I'm learning so much from you. I'm really excited about this. Thank you. Okay, so Shannon, Nia.
I'll go.
Go ahead.
Yeah, I just really wanted to say I totally agree on the education and the understanding. You know, my eyes have just been open too, and I just appreciate that so much. But I would like to see more, you know, as a caregiver voice, maybe some starting like mentorship programs. You know, you go in as a caregiver and you don't know what is happening, what is going on. And I remember it being so lonely and isolating. And I really didn't have anyone to talk to. I didn't know where to turn. I mean, I didn't even know where to look, what a treatment center was. Like, what do I do? Someone told me I need to send my daughter to treatment. What does that mean? You know, and I think that what really I struggled with, you know, was the loneliness and kind of that my daughter is sick, but people have a hard time understanding that my daughter was sick, you know, and it's that myth that maybe you don't look sick. And so you're not that you want sympathy, but you're not getting that same level of kind of understanding from people that my daughter's hospitalized. My daughter is very, you know, and so that was really, and so I just really firmly believe that if there's, you know, if treatment centers could work with some type of mentorship or providers, and that, hey, here's someone who's been there, just even if someone, you know, now I know, now I can seek out and all the knowledge that I've gained, I'm trying to be that person, that's really what, I am just really why I'm here. That's why I'm trying to give back, because it can be a really lonely, hard experience, and trying to be a voice for there, but also for the path and the journey, and what you can learn during that journey.
Agreed. And maybe because we've all been more in the social media era, for me, it's like automatic. If I think, oh, I need to learn something, or I feel lonely because I'm in this new space or figuring something out, I immediately go to social media and try and find that community or find it. But agreed, that isn't what everyone would A, know what to do, or B, feel even comfortable with. They might not even be on social media. So for the provider to figure out another way for people to,
Right.
really connect, that's definitely a great idea.
And when my daughter was diagnosed, it was a few years back. So it just, I think you don't know where to turn. And now I'm in Facebook groups and, gaining strength from social media and being a voice and learning from other people. But then I think you're so scared, and what does all this mean and what is happening? And I think just rather than just letting it happen, learning to be an advocate and learning to be your child's advocate and a voice for your child is what I really, I would like to see people have more help with. And
brilliant. Yes, I so definitely hope that does happen in the future for sure. Okay then, Nia.
All right, so I guess like I wrote down a couple things, but I think like with what Mimi and James said, just like education, but specifically of like medical providers and like therapists and psychiatrists, so that they are aware that fat people can have eating disorders, and how to treat them. And also, I mean, this is a big ask of the world, but just like getting rid of BMI would be really, really cool. And then I think like having more providers of color and like fat providers of color, like that's my goal, is to like be an eating disorder coach or therapist and to be in like a fat Black body and to like be able to like be that representation for people. Because I know that like if I had someone who looked like me as a therapist, like I feel like I would be able to share a lot of my struggles, as opposed to really just having access to like thin white women therapists in the eating disorder field and feeling sort of isolated. And then another big ask is to just make atypical anorexia. That'd be really cool. So yeah.
Listen, I mean, if we keep using our voices, who knows? But when the doctor, when I went and got my first pregnancy test, and literally the first thing he did was put me on the scale and try and tell me about my BMI, I literally said, not today. I was just like,
I don't even let them put me on the scale. They like walk over and they try to turn the scale on, and I say, not today, please. And then we keep walking, and I've not gotten weighed once at this doctor, so.
Oh, that's good. That's not the experience we usually hear about.
Exactly.
No, that you can do that. I think that we feel so in the hands often of those medical professionals, and I mean, the fact that they don't ask for permission, that's again something that we are talking about, obviously our eating disorder communities, but as a generalization of the health industry, there is so much misleading information and mistreatment and misdiagnosing, and just some many insensitivities that people do not want to even bother to get the education to understand. So question number 3.
Can I add something to that?
Yes.
I think those of us who, like, for instance, I'm recovered from an eating disorder. So if I went in and got weighed, it would not be a triggering experience for me. But also I'm a thin person who's not going to experience the same harmful fat phobia in a doctor's office. So I think people like me who are either recovered or have thin privilege or straight size privilege have a responsibility to also ask not to be weighed, unless it's going to be something that affects like the medication you're taking, or there's a legitimate reason that you need to be weighed in that moment. You can also be an advocate and say, no, this is how you can be in allyship with the eating disorder community. And that's something that like we need. as a community. We need to normalize weighing at the doctor's office because it just gives into the racist, fat-phobic BMI stigma that we know through science is not useful. And I'm so grateful that you brought that up because that's something actionable that I think everyone can do, regardless of whether you've personally been affected by an eating disorder or not. Just refuse to be weighed. And if you get pushback on it, just say like you are legally allowed to not be weighed. Like you can refuse that right. And if they give you pushback, you can just say, put refused in my chart. I would love to add one more short thing to that. I know we want to go on, but I think something that would be really useful, especially for providers to approach, especially those that are unfamiliar with eating disorders, approach this conversation as if you already have one, because you likely have been affected by diet culture very severely. And whether you fit the diagnostic criteria is a whole other conversation that we could have about like the systemic racism that is involved in like how the DSM is created, right? Which is not my place to speak on. But the point is that like you may not fit the criteria, but you absolutely may fit some of the toxic, problematic things that are being perpetuated within diet culture. And so if all providers approach it as if you are already part of the problem, then you can be part of the solution. But distancing yourself as a provider is something that causes so much harm for those of us that are walking in trying to get care and then end up being gaslit.
Sure. Okay. Powerful. Thank you. Question number 3. What do you wish we'd have time to touch on during your discussions that you didn't get to touch upon earlier?
No.
So it is any.
I think I just said it. I think I just, yeah. Especially looking at the intersection of like trans people, it's like when we don't understand gender as a society, we don't realize that what we made up doesn't work. And so we don't know how to work with it. And so I wish that we had more time to touch on the different experiences of that, especially because the majority of people in the LGBTQ plus panel are trans and non-binary people that were represented in the recent one, which is great. And that is one of the communities within the queer community that is the most marginalized that we do need to center. And I think as soon as you think you know enough and are comfortable, that's the moment that you do something harmful. We can never know too much about any of those intersections. And I wish we had talked about that because the differences in the anecdotes and in the, well, just the anecdotal evidence needs to be something that is taken more seriously. It's like, especially in the ED community, unless we've seen a stat or a study or it's been, validated by insert Ivy League school here, we tend not to believe it. But the truth is that like many of us sitting here only have anecdotal experience because we have not had the privilege of being studied accurately. So I wish we touched on that more, and I'm really curious to see how everyone else feels about that.
Does anyone else feel like they have something they didn't touch upon in the early discussion that they want to bring up?
Yeah, I'll go. I feel like, I know the roundtables weren't like set to talk about this, so like not even the fault, but like just the intersections of identities with eating disorders, because you've got a lot of people on different panels who have multiple marginalized identities. And so talking about just like one identity is really hard because our identities don't exist in a vacuum. And then also just talking about like the racist roots of fat phobia and diet cultures, just we didn't really touch on that, but I think that's an important topic to talk about.
Agreed. And for people looking for further education, obviously they could follow you. Is there anywhere else that you think that there's really great information on that? Because fat phobia is rife, it's everywhere. As we know, racism is too. But where, if someone was looking right now and they didn't know where to start and they really did want to try and learn, is there a direction they should take or something?
Yes, you would pick up the book Fearing the Black Body by Sabrina Strings. That's where you would start, and that's where you would get your world rocked. So yeah.
And when are all your books coming out, by the way?
Did you know that Sabrina Strings just convinced Deshawn to write a book, and so finally they're also writing one that's like I know. So Deshawn's writing a book about not only body acceptance as it intersects with fatness, and also like the politics around attraction and like who we're attracted to and why. And I feel like not that they're not comparable because they exist in different spaces, but I feel like this might be the cultural sequel that might give us a second renaissance,
Nice.
Question number 4, this is our last question. Oh, and I feel like it's kind of the same as 3, but is there anything you would like to share that we haven't covered? And I guess this could be not to do with your roundtable at all. I'm talking about, like we said, book recommendations, people to follow, anything that you're like, or just maybe an experience or a moment in your recovery journey, or finding who you are and getting to this point that sparks something, in the hopes that maybe it can help someone else in whatever they're going through right now.
Something that comes to mind is that there are added layers to recovery. And so if you have a dual diagnosis or multiple diagnoses, that's going to make it a different experience than if you not just have one disorder. But, I think saying that recovery is, quote, harder for some people doesn't discount your experience or invalidate your experience. There's a lot of dialogue that's like, oh, well, you're saying that because someone else is fat, it's harder for them to recover and it's easier for me. But when we use that word like easier, it really discounts people's experiences. And so I think really holding space and compassion that it's already hard, but for some people it's going to be an added layer of barriers to care, or it's going to be an added layer of difficulty because you exist in a body that the world, and you are recovering into a body that the world does not want. And so I think that's important to mention.
That screams to me so much of last year as well. And as a white person and hearing so many white people just being so upset that they suddenly felt like their issues didn't matter because we were speaking about Black people finally. I think that in this community is so important. And of course, it's not dismissing your respective struggle or your journey, whatever your recovery looks like you said, it's just like, obviously people are going to have a different experience. So yeah, really, I love that. And the compassion that we all have to have for each other, regardless of what that looks like or who we are, is vital. That's how we get stronger together and recover together. So, thank you.
I mean, I think like recently I've been talking to people, and I might have said this in the other panel, I can't really remember, but when we're creating recovery, when we're creating treatment, when we're creating policies and guidelines, we need to be making them for the most marginalized person. And that is the person who suffers from like every single marginalized identity. We don't need to be making it for, like, no offense, cis white heterosexual men, because they are just like top of the privilege chain. And so if we make our recovery and like all of these processes for the most marginalized person, it will benefit everyone straight back up to the cis white heterosexual man. It'll benefit everyone, as opposed to creating recovery for the most privileged and then it only benefits them.
Right, definitely. Gosh, and when you become a therapist, do you think there will be, like we said, we talked about studies, how do we infiltrate that? You know what I mean? Like, how are we going to make sure that if there are those policies, is that something that we are able to do as a community? I feel lost at where to start in that, to try and help you and make sure that that is something that we could possibly change in the future. I don't know.
Yeah.
Iskra, I was earlier wanted to agree with James, just like that validating your lived experience, and that it might not be a formal, something from a university, but there is so much validation in our experiences. And I appreciate so much hearing your stories, and it has really grown me as a human over these years of being involved with NEDA. And so two things I really just want to, I have used that, and you were talking about Iskra, is like in advocacy, because I have really, that's kind of the direction I have followed in going into advocacy. And then, it's so interesting that everyone you meet knows somebody, or knows somebody who that has a connection, or even with an eating disorder, and so that's what I find so fascinating, is that people don't sometimes want to talk about it, or really have a misunderstanding of what that means. And so that's been a really valuable piece for me as a caregiver and going through this, is to take that and use it in an advocacy piece. And that's just been really, really neat to work on. So, but I also wanted to say that I am a second grade teacher. So when you were talking about books and how I now really have to think when I say something or a book I read, is it really, an appropriate book? Or bringing more books into my classroom to introduce all, everyone, and not that, and showing that not all people look the same. And so that's been a really interesting journey for me as a teacher to do that. So
I'm just glad you are prioritizing that, because there are far too many people who get very upset about the fact that they now have to be careful about pronouns or careful about addressing certain people. And I think it's a great thing that we're finally opening up and we're finally starting to be more inclusive and aware. And why people think that that's too much work, I have no idea. Again, it's privileged to not have to think about that.
Sure.
So
I'll send you some book recommendations. I've got some good ones.
okay.
I think like one thing that's also important though, in regards to like things being difficult to do, is that I feel like a lot of people think it's difficult because if you make one mistake, you get like canceled. And so like I think we need to give ourselves grace and understand that maybe you're not going to get it right the first time. That doesn't mean that it's too hard or that you don't keep trying. That means that maybe you screwed up that person's pronouns and you fix them immediately and you move on and you don't apologize and put it back on them. But that also means that you give yourself grace that maybe you screwed up this time, but you're going to keep trying and not just say, this is too hard, I give up.
So does anyone have anything else?
I do. I'd love to add something to that on the topic of the cancel culture. I think we have to recognize that cancel culture actually doesn't work. And so people are really upset about being canceled, and I really want them to be upset that Black women are dying. I want them to be upset that Black trans women are dying. I want them to be upset that neurodivergent and disabled people cannot access care. I want them to be more upset about that and more fearful that people within their community are being absolutely annihilated by a system that they uphold. I want them to be willing to sacrifice their own comfort, myself included with the privileges that I hold, have to be willing to sacrifice our own comfort and the risk of being canceled for the betterment of other people who do not have a chance. And the thing about cancel culture is, and I cannot remember, it was a Black femme creator that just posted this, and I will find it and I'll send it to you so we can put this in like the notes somewhere, because I think it's important to cite where we learn these things from, and I just can't remember their name. Wrote about how cancel culture doesn't work because no one's ever actually been effectively deplatformed by it. Like, name me one Kardashian who doesn't have their platform anymore. Name me a single politician that has killed millions of people that still didn't get to be president. You know what I mean? Like, name me somebody who actually effectively was canceled. It has never happened. And what you might have is a controversy. Please have your controversy, because we need you to be on a pedestal to learn, because people notice, like white people, especially cis people, especially heterosexual people, especially non-disabled people, like are fearful of the cancellation. So when it happens, they notice and listen and learn and figure out what to do that's wrong. That's a great educational opportunity, and you have to be willing to take one for the team, or you're not aligned with the things that you care about. You absolutely have to be willing to take one for the team, or you're not aligned with the communities that you specifically say that you want to care about. Like, you can't have Black Lives Matter in your Instagram bio and not be willing to be called out on your racism and not note that that is a part of your anti-racism work. You can't put your pronouns in your bio on Instagram or in your email signature and then not go, oh, I need to be held accountable for the issue that I may have caused for somebody else about their gender. Like, it's all part of learning. And I think if we invest more, not in being right, but in learning from the things that we do wrong, I really think that we advance ourselves a lot more. And I think instead of looking at, like, you know, right now when we're in kind of a social justice renaissance because we are in a pandemic and have time to think about these things all of a sudden, because like the way we're bogged down by capitalism is very different now. It has changed for many people. There's more space to have these conversations, which is great and also terrifying at the same time that they weren't happening before, right? And I think it's really important it is important to pat ourselves on the back when we get things right, but let's invest more in not, oh, wow, look how inclusive I was. Invest in who's missing, like who's not there. Just like Nia was saying earlier about like centering the most marginalized person, like let's notice our fallacies and our flaws and start getting really comfortable with noticing the limitations. Like that is really, really important. Otherwise we don't get there. Like a limitation of this panel is we haven't talked much about like disability or neurodivergence. That doesn't mean what we haven't had to say has been incredibly important, because it is, and like what a gift it is to hear these perspectives. Also seek out the things that are missing. Go back to your acronym, name every single marginalized community you can, find your 25 million people because they're out there. And you, like anybody who's watching this, has so much more power to combat and be a positive force of change and to use their positionality to create disruption that builds community. It may require taking some down, but you have so much more power to build than you do to destruct. And I think we get caught up in like, what do we hurt? Well, in the process of building, we have to take things down, and you have so much power to build up. It just seems counterintuitive. Thank you for listening to that unintentional TED Talk.
Thank you for that. Thank you for that.
Seriously, thank you so much. Wow. No, I love it. And I hate to say it, but I don't think it's not even the cancel culture. I think it's the bag that people are scared to lose. As someone who's online.
Anyway, you shouldn't have it if you're white. Like,
gets paid by brands, I want to scare them off. So then I know who actually wants to show up for the people who matter. So I think that is one thing that a lot of people are scared about online is, you know, losing their bag because they spoke up about something that brands are scared to touch. So yeah, if anyone's watching, please.
If you live with the kind of, not that there's a scale of privilege, this is not like the oppression Olympics, like that's not what this is, but like if you notice that your life has not, when you start reading narratives from other communities and you realize how much your life has not been impacted by these things and not been made worse by these things, those are privileges, right? Then realize how many opportunities you shouldn't have been offered, you know, like, one of the great things, and like NEDA, you can cut this out if you want to, but like one of the great things about working with NEDA recently is every time I've gotten an email, I've like immediately said, who's on this? Like, who else, what other voices are going to be here? I'm not comfortable being in this space unless these other voices are represented, because otherwise it's, why am I there? Give my thought to someone else. And then it's like, no, we want you here for this reason. Here are the other people that are going to be there. And that's a great way, not that it's like I've figured it out, no, this is a thing I'm learning actively, like in this moment, in this time, like how we can use the opportunities we're given to decide whether we should be in that space or whether we shouldn't. And it bears critique, like, should everybody take the opportunities they're offered? How do we reshuffle those? How do you redistribute the money that you're offered that you may not actually deserve because you may not, you know, it's not that you didn't work hard, but it's like, why do you have that opportunity? Get really critical about it, myself included.
Thank you so much for joining the important discussion, and we hope everyone watching this found some helpful information. I'm sure you did. I know we all did. If you have not already done so, we encourage you to watch all of the roundtables from this week on NEDA's Facebook or YouTube channel. And we're wishing you a happy and meaningful NEDA Awareness Week. Sending our love. Thanks, everyone. Bye.